When I think back to those early days of my marriage, it almost feels like someone else's life. A faded photograph of two people full of hope and trust. I met Julia when I was 28, just as I had started to settle into my career, and she was finishing her graduate program. Our connection felt effortless, like we'd skipped the awkward chapters and landed right in the center of an unbreakable bond. Everything about her drew me in. Her laugh, the way she'd talk about her dreams as if the world were already within her grasp, how she made me feel like nothing truly bad could ever touch us. We had dreams, small and enormous, and in each one, it was always us, together. We'd spend weekends driving with no direction, just to see where we'd end up. We whispered secrets under the covers, talked for hours until the sunrise found us blinking at each other, smiling like fools. There were marriage vows, big white smiles beneath an archway of flowers, promises spoken with trembling voices and shining eyes. I thought, truly and honestly, that I'd found a partner for life. In our tiny first apartment, with its leaky windows and an ancient heater, we laughed off annoyances and built a world that felt strong and simple. The happiness seemed so real, I didn't stop to question whether anything this perfect could last. We made plans and carried them out, one after the other, checking off goals as if nothing could get in our way. Julia pushed me to be better, to go after promotions and gather confidence I never thought I had. I felt like we were a team, like I could lean into her and never worry she'd falter under the weight. Holidays with her family were warm and loud, and I found myself invited into her circle, chosen, accepted. I started to build friendships with her friends, sharing inside jokes, quick glances at parties that made us both grin. My friends envied me. They'd nudge me at dinner parties, raising their glasses, telling me I'd struck gold with Julia. Sometimes, when it was quiet and the only sound was her breath beside me, I'd feel an ache of gratitude so sharp it almost hurt. I remember believing that somehow, against all odds, I'd gotten lucky, that what we had could survive the honest grind of real life, that our happiness was built on solid ground. I didn't know then that happiness can hide so easily beneath the surface, that love can be made out of hopes while other, darker things take root just out of sight. Looking back, the first cracks in our marriage were so faint, I almost convinced myself they weren't there. It started small. Missed calls, unanswered texts, the kind of things that are easy to brush off when you're busy and life feels full. Julia's laughter began to sound less frequent at home, and more forced when it did come. I'd come home after a long day, excited to see her, to tell her some piece of news or share a little joke, but she'd be on her phone, barely looking up. I told myself it was just a busy season, that her job was demanding more of her than usual, and I needed to be patient, but the distance kept growing in subtle ways. A kind of silence bloomed between us, not angry or loud, just empty. She started going out with friends after work more often, coming home later, sometimes offering quick explanations that felt shaky, sometimes not bothering at all. When I asked her about it, she'd smile and kiss my cheek, say I worried too much, that I should trust her. I wanted to believe her so badly that I did, over and over again, even as my gut turned and twisted with a quiet, growing fear. The trust I had always taken for granted started to slip away, replaced by questions I never thought I'd ask myself. Was it something I did? Was I not enough anymore? I began to notice little things, as if I'd suddenly woken up inside the life of a stranger. Our conversations shortened, as if each word was rationed. She stopped asking about my day, stopped laughing at my old stories. Sometimes, I'd catch her staring into the distance, eyes hard, fingers tapping on her phone. We shared a bed, but it was like we lived on separate islands, close but unreachable. I caught myself checking her social media, looking for clues, finding pictures with people I didn't recognize, or comments that sounded just a little too familiar. The change was slow at first, but it spread over everything, until even the happiest memories started to feel fragile, as if they might dissolve if I looked at them for too long. I knew something was wrong, but I was still holding on to the hope that maybe this was just a rough patch, that the woman I loved was still somewhere beneath the distance. The truth was, I was already mourning what used to be, but I wasn't ready to face the reason why. Everything changed the night I finally let my doubt win over my trust. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to snoop on someone I loved, but there was no real way to describe the slow, sinking feeling in my chest every time Julia's phone buzzed, and she shielded the screen from me. That night, when she was in the shower, I picked up her phone, my hand shaking so hard I almost dropped it. The passcode, I realized, was my birthday. It felt like a cruel joke. As soon as I opened her messages, I saw long threads with a contact I didn't recognize, messages full of inside jokes, plans, and things that made my stomach twist. There were photos, some innocent, others I wish I could unsee. Her smile bright for someone else, laughter so real and open, I hadn't seen it in our home for months. The longer I read, the more I understood. Julia wasn't just distant. She'd left me, emotionally, for someone else, long before I ever suspected. She was meeting this other man for drinks, dinners, even weekend escapes she'd always disguised as work trips. Every lie I'd forced myself to swallow, every late night, every excuse, unraveled in front of me with cold, undeniable proof. I sat on the edge of our bed while she was still in the shower, unsure whether to confront her, scream, or just collapse. When she stepped out, wrapped in a towel, all I could see was a stranger, someone I'd loved with all my heart, now attached to a web of lies that stretched back for who knows how long. At first I just asked, barely above a whisper, "Is there someone else?" There was a pause, a measurable, deadly pause, before she shrugged, avoiding my eyes, mumbling something about not meaning for it to happen. Somehow, that hurt as much as the betrayal itself. How easy it was for her to treat love like an accident. Then came a flood of half-truths and justifications. Work stress, feeling alone, needing excitement. All the things I'd tried so hard to fight through because I thought we were worth it. She barely apologized, her tone shifting, defensive and impatient, making it clear she'd already rewritten our history so that my failings offered her permission. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal, but realizing she had planned so carefully to hide the truth. Everything suddenly felt hollow. That night, I saw our marriage for what it had become. A place she visits out of obligation, not love. I wanted some kind of honesty from Julia, a confession, even a tear, anything real. But what I got instead was a wall of cold, practiced words. As I sat there with her phone in my hand, trying to steady my breathing, she looked at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. When I asked her again, more firmly this time, about how long it had really been going on, she rolled her eyes, almost annoyed. She said things like, "If you were paying attention, you'd have seen this coming, and maybe if you hadn't been so focused on work, I wouldn't have felt so alone." Each sentence felt like a punch. She twisted the story, turning her betrayal into my failure, her choices into something she barely had control over. Instead of remorse, she sounded rational, rehearsed, repeating phrases that made me question my own version of reality. She insisted it was just a mistake, but then argued that maybe it had to happen for both of us to see how unhappy we were. The worst part was how quickly she became cold and detached, her words cutting and almost professional. She said we should be adults about it, that everything could be split down the middle, no drama, no hard feelings. She smiled and told me I'd thank her one day for forcing us out of a dead marriage, as if her actions had been a favor. Every time I tried to get her to open up, to admit even an ounce of regret, she'd shift the blame, asking if I was just trying to make her feel guilty, if I thought she was the only one responsible for our problems. She kept her tone calm, polite, even comforting at times, but it was like talking to a lawyer, not the woman I'd loved for so many years. By the end of that night, I realized she had decided somewhere along the way that she didn't owe me the truth. She only owed herself a clean escape. As she left the room, I felt the weight of her manipulation press down harder than the truth itself. I was exhausted, hollow, and angry. But even then, I had no idea just how much more I was about to lose. The word divorce felt like it split the air in two when it finally came out. There was no yelling or dramatic fight, just a chill so deep it numbed me. I remember sitting across from Julia at our kitchen table, The same place where we used to share lazy breakfasts and quiet evenings. Now just a battlefield lined with cold coffee cups and empty plates. She said it almost casually, like she was asking for someone to pass the salt. We both know this is over. Let's not drag it out. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Her fingers just traced circles on the wood, and all I could feel was bitterness. The room felt too small for the tension building between us, and I could barely recognize the person she'd become. I wanted to ask her why she'd given up on us so brutally, why everything we'd built could be tossed aside like a failed project. Instead, I just nodded, barely able to form words. Every corner of our house felt heavy with memories suddenly out of reach. The next few days were filled with a kind of anger I didn't know I could carry. Papers and forms started piling up. Lists dividing things we once called ours into hers and mine. We argued about everything, from the couch to the smallest kitchen appliance, each discussion sharper than the last, packed with old resentments and unspoken wounds. Friends started to pull away, unsure whose side they were supposed to take, or what exactly had happened. It became clear this wasn't going to be an easy or fair separation. Julia wanted control. She wanted to move fast, lock in her victory and frame her story before I even knew what hit me. At night, I lay awake, listening to the silence, rolling back the past year, and wondering when I stopped being her partner and started being the enemy. All my trust was gone, burned away by betrayal, and the cold way she demanded I agreed to her terms. I felt trapped between wanting to fight for what I'd lost and just wanting everything to end, whatever the cost. With every step closer to the divorce, the rancor between us only grew, and any hope of civility slipped further out of reach. Walking into the lawyer's office felt like crossing into another world, a place where emotions had no use, just facts, deadlines, and paperwork. I sat in a stiff chair across from a man in a crisp suit, trying to hide how out of place I felt. I told him my side as best as I could, laying out the story in careful, too simple pieces, hoping for some kind of direction. His eyes didn't show much sympathy, just a kind of tired efficiency, like he had heard these stories 100 times before. "Divorce is rarely fair," he said, flipping through my file, "but I'll make sure you get through it." We went through lists, assets, debts, things I hadn't thought about since before I was married. He asked hard questions about our accounts, the house, what belonged to whom. Every answer felt like letting go of another little piece of my old life. The process was already bigger than me, a wave I just had to survive. Once the official process began, any hope for an easy split vanished. Julia was organized, and fast. Papers arrived almost daily, requests, accusations, demands I'd never anticipated. My lawyer explained what each one meant, sometimes with a frown, sometimes shaking his head as if the demands themselves were personal insults. Suddenly, every argument, every private moment, every financial decision we'd made together was under a microscope. I read through statements in long, sleepless nights, numbers and facts that now felt like weapons. It didn't matter what I felt or what history we shared. Now it was all about percentages, claims, evidence. Julia seemed to become a different person entirely. Confident, businesslike, almost eager to push her advantage. It was like my pain was just another detail on a checklist. My lawyer urged me to stay calm, to not give her ammunition, but it was getting harder every day to keep my anger and sadness in check. As the legal battle began, I finally understood that this wasn't just an ending, it was a war, and I was already losing ground. It didn't take long for me to realize I was at a disadvantage when it came to the money and the things we owned. Julia had always handled most of our bills, managed the accounts, made sure the mortgage was paid. Back then I took it for granted, thinking she was just being responsible or even helpful. Now I saw it differently. She knew exactly where every dollar went, every password, and every detail. As soon as the divorce started, she moved quickly. She froze the joint accounts, canceled credit cards, and made sure the house and car titles were locked in limbo. Suddenly, even simple things like paying my phone bill or getting access to my own checking account became almost impossible. She knew how to use every rule, every loophole, every delay to keep me one step behind. My lawyer warned me, but there was only so much he could do when everything was already in her hands. Meanwhile, Julia moved on like she'd won some contest. She made the big decisions without even pretending to consult me, changing insurance policies, closing out investments, and taking possession of things I'd once called mine. Furniture disappeared. Personal items vanished or showed up boxed and waiting on the porch, as if I was just a tenant being moved out. I watched as she hosted realtors and made plans for our home's future, the home I still thought of as ours, even as it became hers. She showed no hesitation, no second guessing. Money gave her confidence, and she used every bit of it to her advantage in court, arriving with expensive lawyers and a flawless paper trail. My savings dwindled fast, eaten up by legal fees and the simple cost of just trying to survive. There was this growing anger in my chest, mixed with helplessness. Everything I'd worked for, every simple comfort I used to take for granted, felt like it was being erased while she watched, cool and satisfied. Each day, I felt more and more powerless, and she seemed to like it that way. Losing my home and money was hard, but what cut even deeper was watching the people I loved slip away. Julia was always charismatic. People were drawn to her, and over the years, our circles overlapped until most of our friends were shared. When the divorce began, I figured friends would understand, that they'd see how much I was hurting, maybe reach out to check on me. But little by little I realized that she was controlling the story too. She met up for coffee with old friends, sent messages, shared her side first. By the time I tried to explain, it felt like minds were already made up. I watched people I'd known for years stop calling, stop inviting me to things, quiet in their silences or polite to a fault. Even family gatherings became awkward. My parents tried to support me, but Julia had always been close with my sister and cousins. She'd call them, ask about their lives, invite them over even as I sat alone in an empty apartment. My world shrank, leaving me feeling more isolated than ever before. The loneliness during that time was almost unreal. I would pick up my phone to text someone, then put it down, unsure what to say or if it was even worth it. Friends I thought of as brothers didn't answer back, and people I'd laughed with for years now seemed to treat me like a stranger. It stung to see her social media filled with smiling faces, my friends, my family, acting like nothing had happened. In their eyes, maybe I was the one at fault, the one who didn't fight hard enough or keep my marriage together. The house was quiet and empty, the echoes of laughter and parties now reminders of what I'd lost. Every day felt heavier, a mix of anger, sadness, and longing that I couldn't shake. I started to wonder if maybe this was all I deserved, if this was the way things were always going to be now. The pain of that social loss was sometimes sharper than losing the marriage itself. It was as if Julia had taken not just our shared life but my place in the world, leaving me standing on the outside looking in. The day the divorce was final, it felt nothing like closure. I remember walking out of the courthouse, the paper still warm in my hand, heart pounding, with a strange mixture of relief and defeat. Julia was already waiting outside with her lawyer, her posture perfect, her smile so wide it almost seemed cruel. There was no sadness in her face, no regret. Even after years together, she met my eyes with a kind of detached triumph. Her friends flocked around her, all congratulations and excited plans, like she'd just finished a marathon rather than ripped a life in two. She laughed and hugged people, talking about new beginnings, showing off her keys and lists for the new house, already halfway moved into a future where I never existed. The ease with which she celebrated made me realize just how deeply she'd prepared for this, how little our shared memories seemed to mean to her in the end. Looking at her, I felt like I was watching a stranger win a game I never agreed to play. In those weeks that followed, the triumph in Julia's behavior only grew louder. Social media was full of her smiling, hosting dinners in what used to be our living room, sharing inside jokes with friends who had also moved on. She posted about her victories, new furniture, expensive trips, a promotion at work, all tied to her new independent life. People cheered her on, sending her messages of support and admiration for getting through such a hard time. Meanwhile, I packed up boxes in my small apartment, sorting through what little I had left. Old photos I couldn't look at anymore, clothes, the odd piece of furniture not worth fighting over. Even from a distance, I could see Julia building herself a world designed to erase me. Each of her victories felt like a reminder that she'd walked away not just with our past, but with the reputation, the support, and the comfort, while I was left piecing together what scraps I could call my own. I kept waiting for the celebration to slow, for her to show even a spark of doubt or remorse, but none ever came. Instead, her victory just grew brighter each day, while my sense of loss deepened in the shadows she left behind. During the chaos and heartbreak of the divorce, there was one thing I held on to, a secret asset Julia thought was worthless and never bothered to claim. It was a small warehouse space downtown, something I bought long before I met her, back when I was fresh out of college and full of naive ideas. The place was falling apart, too rundown for most people to care about, and for years it sat empty aside from some boxes and odd furniture. Whenever we talked about our property during the divorce, Julia dismissed the warehouse as just another burden, another thing she didn't want to deal with. She scoffed at it in front of her lawyer, rolling her eyes as if I was crazy for even bringing it up. We both agreed to leave it in my name, and she never looked back. Even my own lawyer raised his eyebrows, as if I was clinging to a sinking ship, while she sailed off with all the real treasure. But deep down, I knew the warehouse meant more than anyone realized. It wasn't just about money or memories. It was the last thing that was truly mine, untouched by the mess Julia made of everything else. I remembered the feeling I had when I first got the keys, all that hope and ambition, the sense that with enough patience, something good would come from it. Over the years, the neighborhood around the warehouse had started to change. Coffee shops and tech companies moved in, and property values quietly climbed. I kept an eye on things, fixed what I could, paid the taxes and waited, while everything else slipped away. My house, my savings, my social circle. This battered space stood firm. Julia saw nothing but dust and trouble, but I saw a future. Holding onto that key gave me a reason to believe I wasn't finished yet. It was the one secret I let myself keep, not out of spite, but out of survival. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I promised myself I'd turn that forgotten space into something that would outlast all the pain she left behind. That old warehouse meant so much more to me than Julia could have ever understood. When I bought it all those years ago, I saw it as my first real step into adulthood, a place where I could dream, build, and maybe even create something lasting. Back then, I spent so many weekends there sweeping out the dust, repairing broken windows, and thinking about what the future could look like inside those brick walls. Sometimes I'd bring pizza and a six-pack, sit in the empty space, and let my imagination run wild. I wanted it to be a workshop, an art studio, maybe even a small business if my ideas ever took off. It seemed silly sometimes holding on to that place while life got busy, but it was always in the back of my mind, a quiet reminder that I could shape my own destiny, even as life took me down different paths. As careers changed and relationships came and went, the warehouse stood there waiting for me. During the marriage, I stopped visiting as often, caught up in all the things that felt urgent: work, family dinners, weekend getaways planned by Julia. She felt the warehouse was a mistake, a drain on our savings, something impractical and pointless. Part of me gave in, letting her words chip away at my confidence. But in the lonely months after our split, I found myself driving by more and more. I remember the old dreams, the hope I used to have for that space, and started to see it as an anchor when I felt I was drifting. Inside those walls, surrounded by old tools and scattered memories, I didn't feel judged or dismissed. I just felt like myself. It was humbling to realize how something everyone else overlooked could mean so much when everything else fell apart. That battered old building became a symbol for all the parts of me I'd let Julia ignore, and I was determined, for once, to prove that my forgotten dream had real value. Life after the divorce was harder than I could have ever imagined. The money I'd worked so hard for seemed to disappear overnight. Legal fees, rent for a cramped apartment on the edge of town, Bills that stacked up quicker than I could pay them. Gone were the days of coming home to a stocked fridge, a house filled with comfort, and a sense of stability. Instead, I counted every dollar before making even the smallest purchases. I learned to cook basic meals with whatever was cheapest. Secondhand stores replaced department stores. I canceled memberships and stopped going out with anyone. It wasn't just about money. It was the loss of security, of waking up each morning wondering what bill might hit me next. The world felt smaller, heavier, and lonelier. Some nights I'd just sit in the dim light of my apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had spun so far out of my control. Every plan I'd ever made seemed useless. Each step forward felt like walking through a fog, directionless and slow. Emotionally, I was a mess. The sadness felt like a weight I carried in my chest every single day, pressing in whenever I tried to sleep or force myself to get up in the morning. There was no one to talk to, no friendly voice to remind me it would be okay. My confidence, already bruised by Julia's words and the coldness of our split, was in pieces. I started to question everything. My worth, my judgment, even my ability to recover. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of myself in a window or a mirror and barely recognize the tired, hollow-eyed person staring back. I missed the small comforts most: someone to have coffee with in the morning, a quick text in the middle of the day, the sound of laughter in the home. Even the memories hurt, because they felt like reminders of how far I'd fallen. I fought the urge to stay in bed all day, just letting the world move on without me. That's when I realized how much I'd relied on others for my happiness. The pain was brutal, but deep down, a stubborn part of me refused to give up completely, even if I couldn't see what hope looked like yet. It didn't take me long to realize that justice is not what they promise you in the movies. Courtrooms aren't about right or wrong. They're about paperwork, technicalities, and who can tell the most convincing story. Julia played the part well. She cried at just the right moments, told her polished version of our life, and painted herself as the victim who needed to be protected. Her lawyer was quick with all the right words, slipping in details that made me look uncaring, distracted, or even selfish. Every time I tried to explain my side, it felt like the room got colder, as if the system had already decided who deserved to win. The judge barely looked at me, flipping through stacks of documents while my future was decided in clipped, rushed conversations. There was no space for the real story, no room for the exhausting little truths that made up the history of our marriage. Instead, my life was measured in numbers and neat lines on a page. What hurt even more was knowing how carefully Julia had set everything up. She'd timed every move, every accusation, just right. She knew exactly when to act warm and when to turn cold. She was careful with her words, never sounding angry, always just a bit sad, always the one who had tried so hard. I saw how people bought into her performance. Lawyers, friends, even neighbors. They never saw the way she pressed every advantage, or how she spun any moment of hesitation from me into proof of my guilt. I wanted to shout the truth, show them the other side, but no one wanted to listen. The system loved a clean story, and Julia was the only one allowed to tell it. I felt powerless, barely a player in my own life, and the more I tried to fight back, the more I somehow proved her point. Watching her work the system, using both the rules and people's emotions, left me angry, but also deeply disappointed. In the end, it wasn't just her betrayal that hurt me. It was how easy it was for the world to believe her over me, no matter what I said or did. As the last pieces of my old life slipped further out of reach, something inside me started to change. At first, all I could focus on was the anger and pain, replaying every argument in my mind, feeling powerless and bitter. But somewhere in the quiet moments, a new thought crept in, a stubborn resolve, the tiniest flicker of hope that refused to be crushed. I realized that no one was coming to save me. If I wanted my life back, I would have to rebuild it one step at a time, no matter how hard it felt. So, I stopped waiting for apologies or fairness from Julia, and I stopped expecting the system to even the score, Instead, I started looking at what I had left and what I could do with it. The warehouse, my own skills, the lessons learned from losing everything. All of it became part of a plan that I kept to myself. I read up on zoning, laws, small business loans, and city development. I studied the neighborhood and watched which businesses were thriving. My evenings were spent sketching ideas on scraps of paper, crunching numbers, and picturing a future with the warehouse at its heart. Patience became my new weapon. I knew I couldn't undo what had happened, and I couldn't win back the things Julia had taken in one bold move. But I could take small, steady steps, the kind that went unnoticed by others but slowly added up. I made lists, set goals, and kept my head down. When people asked how I was doing, I offered only the basics. I didn't want advice, sympathy, or more reminders of what I'd lost. Every week, I put in a little more work at the warehouse, repairing the roof, cleaning out old junk, meeting with contractors who could help me see what was possible. I started to believe that maybe my future didn't have to be defined by Julia's win or my defeat. The more I planned, the more I felt purpose creeping back in. Each day gave me a new reason to get out of bed, an inch closer to something that was mine alone. I wasn't going to advertise my progress or seek attention. This plan was silent, patient, and just for me. And that secrecy, that slow building back, felt like the first victory I'd had in a long time. Rebuilding my life after Julia wasn't easy, and it never happened all at once. My first months alone were like walking through thick fog. Hard to see where I was going or if I was getting anywhere at all. But I started with what I could control. Small routines, honest work, and the belief that each day could be a little better than the last. I began waking up early, even when I didn't have to, forcing myself outside just to walk and breathe the morning air. At my job, I worked harder than ever, saying yes to extra shifts or side projects, anything to keep busy and remind myself I was still useful somewhere. Even though the world felt empty, I tried to reconnect with parts of myself I'd ignored for years, old hobbies, music, exercise. It felt awkward and lonely at first, but slowly, the silence in my life started to feel more like peace than punishment. At the warehouse, I committed myself fully. Weekends that used to be spent arguing or sitting quietly in a tense house were now for painting walls, restoring windows, fixing doors, and cleaning every inch of that old space. I learned a lot about patience and hard work, about holding myself accountable when no one else was watching. I watched the neighborhood change around me, met new people, and even asked questions at local businesses about how they started from nothing. Their stories gave me hope, showed me that it was possible to start over at any age, even when you felt broken. I set small targets, finish the floors, rent out a corner to a local artist, or just save enough to upgrade the lighting. Each time I met a goal, no matter how small, I felt a little stronger and a little more like myself. Step by step, I was building a life far away from Julia's shadow, crafting a future that belonged only to me. Every evening, when I locked up the warehouse and looked back at what I'd done, I saw proof that I could survive on my own, and maybe even find a little pride along the way. I heard about Julia's new life long before I saw any signs of trouble. In the beginning, her world looked perfect. Photos of shiny new rooms, vacations, improvements to our old house, and endless posts about her busy, exciting routine. But over time, the stories changed. Friends who'd once taken her side started reaching out to me, quietly at first, asking if I'd heard from her or if there was something wrong. I tried not to care, tried to keep my focus on my own quiet progress, but it was hard to ignore the whispers. She was having trouble at work, they said. Her new job was more stressful than she'd expected, and her management style rubbed some people the wrong way. Her old quick charm didn't have the magic it once did, especially when things got tense. People who looked up to her now started to distance themselves after feeling used or manipulated. Even her closest supporters and friends grew tired of the drama, the constant need for attention and praise. I could see it happening from a distance, bit by bit. Julia was losing the hold she'd worked so hard to build. There were other cracks, too. I'd go by the old neighborhood and see the house looking a little less put together every month. Paint peeling, weeds breaking through the perfect lawn she'd once been so proud of. Small repairs were left undone or handled in a hurry. She made big purchases, but the shine didn't last, and somehow she always seemed to want more. She bounced from one excitement to another, but deep down, she seemed restless, anxious, and maybe even lonely. Her old crowd started spending less time with her, and some former friends stopped coming round altogether. I even got a few emails from people apologizing for how things had gone, admitting they hadn't really known the whole story. It felt strange to watch Julia struggle, knowing how sure she'd once been that she'd won it all. I didn't take joy in her frustration, but there was a quiet sense of justice in seeing things finally catch up with her. For once, the world saw that charm and confidence weren't enough to carry you forever. Not if you built your life on half-truths and selfishness. I kept my distance from Julia, but it was impossible not to notice how different her life looked now compared to those first months of freedom. She was everywhere, always busy, always chasing after the next big thing, but somehow always unsettled. People in our old circle told stories about her that felt both familiar and strangely sad. Big plans that fizzled, business ideas that went nowhere, friendships that fell apart after too much gossip or drama. I'd catch glimpses of her at community events, always moving quickly through the crowd, her laughter a little too loud, her stories a little forced. There was a tension to the way she moved, a sense that she was always trying to stay one step ahead of some creeping failure only she could see. She tried to look like she was thriving, but underneath, I could see the cracks, small, tired smiles when no one was looking, moments when she seemed almost lost in her own whirlwind. From the outside, it looked like she was still holding everything together, but watching closely, I saw her make mistake after mistake. There were bills unpaid, promises broken, and decisions made out of pride rather than sense. She took on more than she could handle at work, then blamed others when things unraveled. Old friends drifted away quietly, tired of the endless drama, the late-night calls full of complaints and half-truths. I realized Julia spent all her energy maintaining an image that no longer matched her reality. Sometimes I wondered if she remembered the person she used to be, the one who could listen, who could dream big and act with kindness. Now, it seemed, every choice she made came from a desperation to appear perfect, to prove something to the world she'd already convinced she was right. I didn't feel angry anymore. If anything, there was a strange kind of sadness in seeing her push so hard and end up so alone. From a distance, I watched her world shrink, just as mine was slowly opening back up. As I kept quietly building my warehouse and piecing my life together, I realized just how much potential I was sitting on. Over those long months, the neighborhood around the warehouse kept growing. New cafes opened, people talked about investment, and suddenly everyone wanted in on the next big project. The old warehouse, once ignored, started to look like gold to the right eyes. Developers called with offers, some neighbors reached out about renting space, and word got around that the city might rezone the area, making properties even more valuable. I watched all of this unfold without rushing to make a move. Instead, I started asking smart questions, connecting with business owners and learning what buyers were looking for. All the while, Julia had no clue. She'd never cared about the place, so it wasn't even in her line of sight. But I remembered every detail from my marriage. How she always wanted to impress people, show off what she owned. I knew the right opportunity might do more than just make me money. It could put real pressure on her world. When the right moment finally came, I made my move. Word of the warehouse's increased value traveled fast, and suddenly, Julia's circle, her old friends, even people she wanted to impress professionally, started asking how she'd missed out on it. I started exploring a deal with a partner who was well connected in the city, and quietly let the news slip to people I knew would bring it back to Julia. I didn't need to gloat. The numbers spoke for themselves. Here was a piece of property she had dismissed as junk, about to become the cornerstone of a new hotspot in the city. People started whispering behind her back, questioning her judgment, the stories she always told about being clever and winning, everything in the divorce. That made her nervous. For the first time, I saw her reach out to people from my side, suddenly curious about old paperwork and looking for some trace of the deal she'd overlooked. Too late. It was already locked, and she had no claim. The strategic value wasn't just cash in my pocket. It was the shift in power, the one move she hadn't seen coming. For the first time, I was in control, and she was the one scrambling for answers. It happened faster than I expected. Once Julia's carefully built story started to show cracks, the rest unraveled quickly. The people who had propped her up began to pull away as soon as they saw her fumble. Business deals she'd bragged about fell through one after another. Old friends stopped returning her calls. Invitations dried up. The people who once praised her relentless drive started to talk about her mistakes instead. It wasn't all about the warehouse, but the spotlight on her bad judgment was suddenly impossible for her to hide. As she tried to spin the story, claimed she was still on top, but the whispers only grew louder. Her new house needed repairs she couldn't afford, and her lifestyle, always expensive, became too much to handle without the constant approval and connections she relied on. Even on social media, her photos felt staged, her captions forced, as if she knew she was losing the audience, who once cheered her every move. Behind closed doors, things got worse for her. Debts piled up, and her work became a struggle as her reputation for being driven turned into a reputation for being difficult and impulsive. People remembered the way she'd treated them, the coldness or the quick way she dropped friends she no longer needed. Suddenly, she had no safety net. The network she'd counted on for backup loans or favors had dried up, replaced by short, awkward replies or silence altogether. She tried to shore things up alone, but nothing worked. Every fix seemed to make things worse. I heard stories through mutual friends, late payments, deals canceled at the last second, jobs she'd once felt secure in now at risk. Meanwhile, the city moved forward with plans for my warehouse, and I was suddenly getting congratulated by people who had once looked right through me. Julia's world shrank around her, her voice lost in a crowd that no longer cared. For the first time, she was forced to watch as her control over her life and her image slipped right out of her hands. There's a strange thing that happens when someone who always seemed so strong finally faces their breaking point. For so long, Julia wore her confidence like armor, the way she walked, the way she talked to people, even the way she smiled at her own reflection. But I started to see the real cracks when her struggles hit a peak. A mutual friend told me that Julia had broken down at a work event, tears coming out of nowhere when she thought no one was watching. She tried to play it off, but those who saw it recognized a kind of pain that couldn't be hidden by quick jokes or clever comebacks. For the first time, her mask slipped. She avoided the people she used to lean on, stopped going to the places where she once felt important. Her world became smaller, her posts online more desperate, searching for sympathy where applause used to be. I could tell she was genuinely scared of losing her job, her house, and the reputation she'd spent years carefully building. Her crisis was more than financial or social. It was personal, the kind that shakes you at your core. She started making calls late at night to old friends who barely remembered her, or to colleagues she once dismissed. Some people tried to help, but most had already moved on, tired of her drama. Julia had always been quick to judge weakness in others, but now she was forced to feel it herself, raw and exposed, with no one there to cushion her fall. I heard about her missing important deadlines at work, her health getting worse from all the stress, and the way her once sharp voice became shaky and thin. She finally had to admit, even if just to herself, that she couldn't control everything by force of will. For someone who'd always relied on her image of strength, her crisis revealed just how fragile she really was underneath. I was surprised by how much I felt for her. No victory in her pain, just a quiet recognition of how hard it can be when the world stops believing in you, and you don't even believe in yourself. During my hardest months, it was easy to feel like I was truly alone. That's what heartbreak, betrayal, and loss can do to you. But as I poured energy into rebuilding my life in the warehouse, something changed. New people came into my world, drawn not by gossip or drama, but by honest work and shared goals. One of the first was Tony, a contractor from the neighborhood, who noticed me working every weekend and offered advice over coffee. He'd started with nothing himself and respected that I was rebuilding from scratch. Before long, he introduced me to his network, local business owners, city planners, and even a real estate agent who had a knack for turning old properties into thriving local hubs. These people looked past the rumors that stuck to my name after the divorce. They judged me by my effort and my ideas, not Julia's old stories. With each new connection, my confidence grew, and I began to remember what it was like to have support that wasn't attached to conditions or doubts. It was more than just professional help. A few friends I thought I'd lost reached out, apologizing for taking Julia's side or believing half of what they heard back then. There were awkward conversations at first, but honest ones, sharing stories of where we went wrong and how we misunderstood each other. In time, we rebuilt trust. Together, we made plans for the warehouse, volunteered at neighborhood events, and began to feel a sense of community growing around us. My parents, once worried for me, now came by with meals and small repairs, proud to see that I hadn't given up. Every time someone invested time, advice, or encouragement into my dream, I felt the ground under my feet get a bit more solid. Surrounded by these new and renewed allies, I felt safer, more capable, and less like a man haunted by his past. Their loyalty and support built me up in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Together, step by step, we turned the warehouse from a personal project into a gathering place, and I realized that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover who's really willing to stand with you as you rebuild. When the news finally spread about the warehouse's value, the impact was bigger than I expected. It wasn't just gossip. Real questions started piling up around Julia, and not just among our old friends, but in business circles and local community groups. People wanted to know why she ignored such a valuable asset, especially after she'd always presented herself as someone who knew how to get the best deal. Some of those questions turned public, with people commenting online or bringing it up at community meetings where she used to hold court. Her reputation as someone smart and calculating started to unwind as the truth came out. It wasn't about ruining her with lies, it was about letting the facts speak. All her old claims about winning the divorce were now questioned, her choices suddenly the subject of open discussion and doubt. Even people who had always supported her began to rethink everything they'd believed. On top of the social backlash, there were suddenly legal questions too. Some of the decisions she made with our shared property had to be re-examined, especially since she'd openly dismissed the warehouse in the official paperwork. The new value of the place made certain details more important: taxes, rights to adjoining properties, the agreements she'd signed and what she had left out. It all drew attention from lawyers, city officials, and even a few journalists who liked to write about changes in the neighborhood and the people behind them. For the first time, Julia was on the defensive, having to explain her decisions, clarify statements, and in some cases, respond to official letters and requests. I kept my distance, careful not to add fuel to the fire, but people around her now wanted answers. She could no longer control the story or spin her way out. The pressure from both sides, public and legal, put her where she had once placed me, alone, facing the consequences of her own actions, wishing for an easy escape that wasn't coming. Julia's reaction when the questions began swirling was nothing like the confident, in-control woman she'd always shown the world. At first, she tried to brush off the rumors, saying people didn't know the full story or were exaggerating just to stir up trouble. She gave interviews and posted online, carefully worded statements about irrelevant assets and unfair assumptions. But the more she fought back, the more desperate she looked. People could sense something was wrong. Her responses came off as rehearsed and defensive instead of honest and calm. She tried to keep her old friends close, but they saw through the act. She blamed others for bad advice and claimed she'd been misled, always shifting the blame away from herself. The harder she tried to stay above it all, the more obvious it became that the cracks in her image were real and deep. As pressure mounted, Julia's arrogance showed through just as much as her panic. Rather than admit any wrong or show humility, she doubled down on her usual tactics, insisting she was the victim, that people were jealous of her success, and that I had set her up on purpose. Her tone in public turned sharp and sometimes cruel. She started fights with rivals or people she once called friends. She even reached out to me with a message full of accusations and empty threats, hoping to scare me into silence or guilt. But this time, nobody was buying it. The more she pushed, the more people turned away, tired of the drama and her refusal to accept responsibility. Her desperation made her careless, and her arrogance left her isolated. I watched from a safe distance, realizing that sometimes you don't have to fight for revenge. The truth, once finally out in the open, does its own quiet work. Julia, who once loved attention and control, now faced a world she couldn't manipulate with charm or anger. While everything around Julia seemed to spiral out of control, I made a choice to stay calm and quiet. No matter how intense things got, I knew that stirring up drama, arguing back, or trying to prove myself to the world would only drag me down to her level. Instead, I focused on my work at the warehouse and the people who now stood by my side. I kept my life simple and refused to pick fights, ignored the gossip, and stuck with the facts. When people asked about Julia or wanted my side of the story, I just told them I wished her well and was focused on moving forward. There was a sense of peace that came from not having to lie or exaggerate, from letting my actions and patience speak for me. I had seen firsthand how the truth, when given time and light, can grow stronger than any rumor or accusation. I think that's what gave me my real strength, trusting that I didn't need to control the narrative anymore. I stopped feeling the urge to clear my name or take pleasure in Julia's downfall. It was enough to see my own path clearly, to know that my choices and my integrity would survive, no matter what storms passed through her life. Every day I poured more energy into new projects, new friendships, and finally let the pain of the past start to blur behind me. I grew more patient as I waited for things to resolve, knowing that you can't rush justice and you can't force people to see the truth before they're ready. So I watched and waited, steady and calm, certain that the peak of this drama would come and go. My grip on my own peace grew tighter. By doing nothing but living well, and honestly, I let everything else take care of itself. It was the first time in years I truly felt free. No longer her opponent, just a man quietly building something better than before. Little by little, the truth about everything, our marriage, the divorce, the so-called victory, started to find its way into the open. It wasn't because I spread stories or tried to change anyone's mind. It was just that people saw what happened to Julia, and they started to remember the small things they'd ignored in the past. Friends who once judged me for walking away began to ask their own questions. They connected the dots between her sudden rise and her just as sudden fall. Old friends, colleagues, even neighbors realized the image she'd worked so hard to control wasn't real. They started to see the ways she used people, how her confidence masked deeper problems, and how she twisted the narrative to fit whatever she needed in that moment. I watched the change happen quietly. Conversations at local events, messages from people with apologies or confessions, even a few asking for advice or wanting another chance to get to know me. For a long time, I felt invisible, but now I could see that people were finally looking past Julia's stories and seeing me for who I actually was. The best part was that I didn't have to force any of it. Those who really wanted the truth found it naturally. People saw Julia's mistakes, her unwillingness to admit fault, and her pattern of blaming others. Meanwhile, my patient approach made an impression. I wasn't chasing anyone's approval or attention. I just kept doing good work, treating people with respect, and letting my actions prove my character. It meant more to have trust built back slowly than to win any argument with dramatic proof or revenge. With time, old wounds started to heal. As others realized how much of the story had been hidden or distorted, I could finally have conversations without bitterness or defensiveness. I saw genuine regret from old friends and simple kindness from new ones. It was like breathing fresh air after being stuck in a windowless room for too long. Slowly but surely, the world around me changed, and I got the rare chance to start over with the truth on my side. The moment Julia's manipulation and lies became public, it was almost surreal. I'd spent so much time doubting myself and wondering if anyone would ever see what had really gone on behind closed doors. But it finally happened at a community forum, of all places. A meeting about the new developments in the neighborhood. People showed up expecting a normal discussion, but the topic of the warehouse deal came up, and questions about the divorce suddenly spilled into open conversation. Someone I barely knew asked about why Julia never claimed the property, and another person spoke up about the way she'd misled people for years. The room was tense. You could feel the shift as more and more details emerged. People talked openly about how Julia's story never quite added up, how she always seemed to have an excuse or someone to blame. Eyes turned to her, waiting for some kind of explanation, but all she could do was defend herself with the same tired lines. It was clear her version of things couldn't hold up in the daylight anymore. After that night, word spread quickly. Neighbors, friends, and even old co-workers finally felt free to share their own experiences. Stories came out about favors never repaid, empty promises, and little games she'd played to get ahead. People connected those small betrayals and half-truths to the bigger picture, and suddenly, the charm that used to blind them was gone. Julia lost her influence almost overnight, not because I fought for it, but because the truth became undeniable when enough people told their stories. She stopped showing up to social events, dodged conversations, and let her online presence fade. I watched as people who once celebrated her now quietly distanced themselves. It was bittersweet for me. I never wanted to see anyone publicly humiliated, but it was a relief to know that the lies no longer had power. For the first time, I didn't need to defend myself. Everyone finally saw what I'd lived through, and that, in its own way, was a kind of justice I could never have gotten alone. The fallout for Julia hit quickly once the truth was out in public. She started getting official letters from lawyers about the warehouse paperwork and some old agreements she had ignored or misrepresented. There were questions about taxes and unpaid bills that she could no longer dodge with fast talk or charm. She was called in to explain herself at work, forced to face not just the rumors but actual investigations into some of her decisions. I heard she even had to hire new legal help, at a cost she could barely manage, just to handle the mess she'd caused. The money she'd once flaunted was now drained by debts, repairs, and trying to hang on to a lifestyle she'd built on image alone. Her once impressive reputation crumbled. Some of the people who had looked up to her professionally pulled their support, realizing her success came more from manipulation than real work. She'd always thought she was clever enough to bend the truth without ever paying the price, but now the consequences were real and unavoidable. Socially, her world shrank even further. All those friends who had crowded around her after the divorce, praising her, taking her side, quietly vanished. Invitations stopped, public support turned to silence, and sometimes even open criticism. She lost her place in groups she'd once managed, found herself left off messages and out of meetings where she'd usually been the star. There was no more applause when she posted about her life online, just a handful of polite responses and a lot of people quietly watching. People who once believed her stories avoided her now, both out of disappointment and a sense of betrayal. She'd built everything on the idea of always landing on her feet, always being right. But now, faced with real and lasting consequences, Julia finally had to live with the choices she'd made. I could see, even from far away, how isolating her world had become. The truth, out in the open, didn't give her a shot at revenge. It simply took away her power and left her alone to answer for what she'd done. It felt strange at first to watch things come full circle. For so long, I believed the losses for my marriage, my money, my sense of home, my reputation, were permanent. But as Julia's influence faded and the truth about the divorce spread, I started getting pieces of my old life back. The warehouse I'd held onto in secret became a lifeline, not just financially but emotionally too. It finally sold for more than I'd ever dreamed, and the profit allowed me to pay off debts, move into a better place, and even start a small business that I ran on my own terms. People I thought I had lost for good came back with honest apologies, and new friends came into my life, drawn not by drama, but by the real work I'd built from nothing. Each small victory reminded me that not all losses are forever. Sometimes, with enough patience, what's taken from us returns in new forms. But it was the moral victories that mattered most. For the first time since the divorce, I could look in the mirror and see someone with dignity and self-respect. I didn't win by tearing Julia down or by seeking revenge. I won by holding firm to my own values, by refusing to play her games, and by rebuilding a life I could actually be proud of. The friends who stood by me did so because they knew my true character, and the community that gathered around the warehouse saw not the rumors but my effort and honesty. Even my family, who had weathered so much tension, came back together, proud to see me recover without bitterness or blame. Every lesson, every long night of loneliness and doubt had shaped me into someone stronger. At last, I was free to move forward, not as the guy who lost everything, but as the man who earned back more than he imagined possible. With my head high, I knew I was finally whole again, in ways I never would have been if I hadn't survived the storm. For so long, I thought nothing would ever replace the emptiness the divorce left behind. There were nights when all I could feel was the ache of everything I'd lost: trust, hope, the life I thought I was building. But slowly, as the truth came out and my own life improved, I began to feel something different rising up inside me. It wasn't joy in Julia's downfall or even satisfaction from getting some of my possessions back. It was a quiet, settling sense of justice. I saw that the world had tilted back into balance, not because I forced it, but because eventually people saw for themselves the kind of person I really was, and the damage Julia had caused. I realized I didn't need to be angry or hurt anymore. I'd survived hardship, told the truth, and endured, and in return, I found peace. The bitterness faded, replaced by a deep, steady pride in what I'd rebuilt. That sense of justice didn't erase the scars or bring back lost time, but it filled the empty spaces with purpose and self-respect. I stopped measuring my worth by what had been taken from me and started to focus on what I'd created on my own. My days became fuller, not with distractions or shallow victories, but with real work, gentle friendships, and moments of calm I'd forgotten how to enjoy. I could now be honest about my pain, but I didn't let it define me. In Julia's absence, I discovered who I could be when I was free from manipulation and blame. I learned that real justice doesn't always punch back. Sometimes it's just the world watching quietly as truth and hard work win out in the end. With each sunrise, I found myself moving forward, lighter than the day before. The space where loss once ruled now filled with quiet confidence and relief that I'd made it to the other side. Sometimes, the memories come back to me unexpectedly, like flashes of pain and strength mixed together. I remember those silent nights in the apartment, when loneliness pressed in from every wall. I'd sit awake, staring at my phone, wishing for a message, a single reminder that I wasn't forgotten or unworthy. Those first nights after moving out were the worst. I barely slept, haunted by old conversations I replayed in my mind, always wondering what I could have done differently. Even my body felt different, tired, heavy, weighed down by stress and the ache of losing everything I'd built. There were days at work when I had to excuse myself just to catch my breath, because the emotion would hit out of nowhere. At the time, it felt like I was caught in a storm that would never pass, every bit of happiness washed away by regrets and hard truths. That pain ran so deep, I started to doubt I'd ever feel normal again. But even in the worst of it, something inside me kept whispering, "Hold on, just keep moving." Looking back, I see how much it took to survive, not just the divorce, but the everyday battle to reclaim my life. I remember fixing that old warehouse when the cold wind blew through broken windows. Each nail I hammered a tiny act of defiance against the idea that I was defeated. I remember fighting through discouragement, one bill and one setback at a time, never letting Julia's voice, the one that said I was weak or foolish, become my own. Whenever I wanted to give up, I'd force myself to put on my shoes, walk outside, and just face the world, no matter how small the steps seemed. In those hard moments, I learned that resilience wasn't big or noble. Sometimes it was simply dragging myself out of bed, making coffee or calling a friend, even when I felt like a burden. Those small fights, choosing patience over anger, work over self-pity, honesty over easy comfort, are what saved me. They're the moments I carry now, proof that the worst days didn't break me. They taught me I was stronger than I knew, and that no darkness lasts forever if you keep moving forward. News travels fast in our old community, and Julia was used to being at the center of it all. Now, though, she was on the outside, looking in. The few times I saw her in public, she seemed to carry a shadow with her, shoulders hunched, gaze darting, always looking for someone who might welcome her back. But the welcome was gone. Once, everyone hung on her every word, but now, people kept their distance. At local events, she stood at the edge while the conversations moved forward without her. Even her old routines, going to popular coffee shops, running errands where she'd easily find a friendly face, felt different. People glanced away or offered only short, awkward greetings. Where she once held the spotlight, Julia now haunted the background, uncertain and alone. The isolation grew heavier as trust in her faded away. Friends who had once formed her inner circle slowly stopped believing the stories she told, especially after the truth about the divorce and her decisions became widely known. She tried to reach out, but most people returned only silence or polite excuses not to meet. Even online, her posts got fewer comments and more of her messages went ignored. Invitations she once took for granted stopped arriving, and she no longer played any part in the gatherings that once revolved around her charm. The friendly faces had been replaced by wariness. No one wanted to be drawn into more drama, and everyone seemed careful not to get too close. Julia, who made her whole world public, now found herself invisible. Watching her face that suspicion and loneliness was strangely sobering. Her world had shrunk to the walls she'd built herself, and now there was no one left to help her break them down. All she had left was the hard truth that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. Looking at my wife now, I barely recognize the man I was back then. There's a kind of calm in me I never felt before, something deep and still, the quiet strength that comes from surviving what once seemed impossible. I don't wake up with dread anymore. Most days I open my eyes and feel genuinely excited to meet whatever is waiting. I get up early, spend a few moments with my coffee, and plan my day. Or simply appreciate the quiet. The warehouse is now a place full of work, laughter, and new beginnings, not just for me, but for other people too. Sometimes I stand in the doorway, watching sunlight fill the old building, and feel proud that my hands made this possible. I listen more closely, laugh a little easier, and trust my own judgment instead of doubting it. The pain of my past hasn't disappeared, but it's just one part of a much bigger story, and at last, it doesn't define every chapter. Being stronger doesn't mean I never feel hurt, but it does mean I handle things differently. When I face problems now, I pause and think before reacting. I make decisions that are good for me, not just for comfort or out of habit. I've learned to trust the slow, steady work of rebuilding every friendship, every new project, every lesson learned. People who know my story sometimes ask how I forgave everything, how I found peace. The truth is, becoming conscious of my own strength changed me. I now choose my battles and let go of things that aren't worth my energy. The bitter feelings toward Julia faded as I realized her actions couldn't shape my future unless I let them. I stopped measuring myself by what I'd lost and started seeing myself through the eyes of those who respected what I'd built. There's happiness in simple things. The smell of sawdust, a fresh coat of paint, new friends laughing in a once empty space. I'm not just moving on, I'm moving forward with confidence, open to whatever life has for me next. If there's one thing life has taught me through all of this, It's that perseverance is everything. It's not the loud, heroic kind you see in stories, but a quieter, day-after-day commitment not to give up. There were so many times I wanted to walk away from it all, nights when loneliness made my goals seem pointless, days when every step forward came with a dozen setbacks. But I learned that if you hold on just a little longer than you think you can, it gets easier. Each time I chose to keep going, even with nothing more than stubborn hope, I found new strength waiting for me. I realized that most victories aren't dramatic. They're built from small acts of patience and the unseen work of simply not quitting. That's what saved me in the end. Not anger, not getting even, but refusing to let a hard season of life write my story for me. But patience alone isn't enough if you don't act with some intelligence. I learned to pay close attention to my own choices and the world around me. Instead of reacting in anger or bitterness, I tried to look for the smartest way through every mess, even if that meant keeping silent or waiting for just the right moment to act. When I focused on solutions instead of problems, I found doors opening that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. Keeping my plans to myself, learning from past mistakes, and thinking several steps ahead became my way forward, not scheming, but simply being wise with what I had left. The combination of perseverance and intelligent action is what helped me rebuild my life stronger than before. If you hold on long enough and think clearly while you do, you find out you can survive much more than you think, and sometimes you even come out better on the other side. That realization is a lesson I'll carry with me no matter what comes next. Winning at the end of this struggle wasn't about proving Julia wrong or seeing her face the consequences, though for a long time that was all I could think about. The real victory was much deeper. I realized that my fight was never really against her, but against the dark conviction that my life would always be shaped by loss and betrayal. Every day I stood back up, every time I patched another hole in the warehouse or reached out to a new friend, I was taking a stand against the idea that the worst thing to happen to me would define everything that came after. I wasn't just reclaiming lost property or reputation. I was reclaiming the belief that I had a say in my own future. That feeling, knowing my life was my own again, meant more than any courtroom win or public apology ever could. I finally understood that true justice is about overcoming setbacks, not just outlasting your enemies. The cruelest fate would have been staying stuck, bitter, small, and afraid to start again. But through patience and hard work, I carved out something new for myself. The day I realized I'd built a life that made me proud, the day I smiled without having to think of the past, was the true moment of triumph. Julia and everyone else could spin their own stories, but they no longer controlled mine. No amount of anger or wishing for revenge could have given me what I have now, a sense of wholeness, meaning, and genuine hope for whatever lies ahead. I beat the odds not by getting everything back, but by not letting the pain turn me cold inside. In the end, my biggest victory wasn't about winning over an ex. It was conquering the harshness of fate itself and finding peace in places I never thought I'd see again. The secret resource that changed everything was that old warehouse. Something so easily overlooked that even Julia, who had picked through every piece of our life, had written it off as worthless. It wasn't shiny, flashy, or promising at first glance. Years ago, I bought it with the little savings I had, betting on some hope that the city would eventually revive the area. I used to joke that it would just collect dust forever, but part of me dreamed bigger. When we got married, Julia looked at the warehouse as a mistake, just another responsibility, leaking money, and loaded with headaches. She told me more than once that she didn't want to babysit some crumbling old property, and dismissed all my plans for it. During the divorce, she focused on the house, the cars, and the savings accounts, never imagining that something so battered could be valuable. The truth is, she never asked what it meant to me. She only cared about things that fit her idea of success. Why did Julia ignore it? Simply because she couldn't see past its flaws. She never believed in things that took patience or vision. She wanted her wins handed to her, obvious and immediate. The property needed work, had risks, and didn't give her the right kind of bragging rights. I kept silent about its true worth because I saw the neighborhood changing, the city investing in local businesses, property values climbing, creative people moving in. As everyone else turned away from that old building, I held on, remembered what it meant to take a long view, and trusted my instincts. In the end, what she threw away as a burden became the foundation for my new life. Sometimes, I think that's the lesson. The things most people ignore are the quiet hopes we keep alive through rough times, can end up being the very resources that save us in the end. The warehouse was never just about money. It was about the strength to see value where others only saw problems. That's what made all the difference. Standing at the door of the warehouse, now full of possibilities and laughter, I finally felt peace settle in my chest. The feeling I'd chased for years but had almost forgotten could exist. The long journey from heartbreak to healing gave me back something I didn't think I'd ever see again: my dignity. I remembered all the nights alone, the doubt and the pain, feeling as if I'd been stripped of everything I ever cared about. Yet here I was, alive and standing, able to walk through my own life with my head high. I looked at the hands that had once trembled with fear and saw strength had replaced the shaking. My days no longer revolved around anger or regret. Instead, I met each sunrise with quiet gratitude, knowing that no matter what Julia or anyone else remembered, I'd survived with my character and my truth intact. It's a strange kind of victory, not loud or showy, but deep. The people around me now are here because they care for who I really am, not for what I can give them, or what story I could tell. I live simply, but every part of my life is honest and earned. The old wounds don't rule me anymore. Instead, they're reminders of where I've been and proof that dignity isn't something someone else can give or take away. It's something you find inside yourself, rebuilt piece by piece after the worst storms have passed. I move through each day free from bitterness, ready for whatever the future holds, and aware that real peace is never about erasing the past. It's about learning from it, making better choices, and finally coming home to yourself. In the end, I didn't just get through the pain. I left it behind and chose something better. That's the life Julia could never steal, and the dignity that's all my own. If there's any lesson I carry from all of this, it's that life has a way of surprising us with justice. Just not always in the way we expect or when we want it most. When Julia left and took almost everything, I thought I'd lost any hope of winning, but as time went on, I realized that sometimes the things we lose make space for victories we never saw coming. Losing my home, my money, and my old life felt like seeing the world end, but underneath that loss, there was something quietly growing, a chance to rebuild, to find out who I was when no one else was watching, and to recover my pride in ways that no court or apology ever could have given me. The poetic part is that Julia, chasing only appearances and quick wins, missed the one thing with real, lasting value. It was almost as if the universe hid my best card, where only patience and hope would ever find it. The truth is, real victory doesn't always look like winning on paper. It happens when you let go of the need to get even, and trust that, with effort and time, life will restore what's rightfully yours in unexpected ways. Justice found me not because I hunted for revenge, but because I focused on honesty, hard work, and quiet integrity. Losing something bigger than you think you can bear can be the exact reason you discover your greatest strength. For anyone facing a loss that feels final, know that the story isn't finished yet. Sometimes what seems like defeat is just the world clearing space for a new kind of victory. I've learned that justice is patient, and when it finally comes, it not only sets things right, it gives you back the peace and dignity you thought were gone forever. That's a win no one else can touch. There was a day, not long ago, when I saw Julia from across the street. She looked so different from the woman I once knew. Shoulders hunched, eyes darting, walking quickly as if afraid someone might stop her or demand something she couldn't give. There was no crowd around her, no laughter or admiring glances, just her by herself, lost in thought. Part of me expected to feel triumph or relief at seeing her alone, weighed down by choices she thought would guarantee her happiness. But instead, I just felt a quiet sense of distance. She had become a stranger, shaped by her own decisions and the consequences that came after, just as I had been shaped by mine. I watched her disappear into the crowd, a reminder that the road we choose always leads us somewhere, even if we think we're in control. The world she built was now smaller, quieter, and the cost of her victories had caught up with her in the end. Turning away, I focused on the future, on new plans, new goals, and all the possibilities waiting for me. With every step, I felt lighter and more certain that my life was truly my own at last. The pain and anger that once chased me were gone, replaced by calm and genuine hope. I realized I didn't need Julia or anyone else to see how far I'd come or how much I had learned. The journey through loss, betrayal, and healing had made me resilient and wise. Every wound had become a lesson, and every lesson a stepping stone toward a better life. As I walked forward, the city around me felt brighter, every street and doorway opening into new beginnings I'd earned for myself. Whatever waited ahead, I knew I was ready. My past was behind me, and I carried only what mattered most: dignity, peace, and the belief that the future still held so much for me to discover.